The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Dorothy Joplin would remember that detail with a precision that surprised even her. Not the content of the letter first, not the handwriting on the envelope, but the day. Tuesday, what? A September Tuesday in 1970, ordinary in every external way, the kind of day that does not announce itself as significant while it is happening. The mail came at its usual time. The envelope was among the usual envelopes. The handwriting on the front was familiar, immediately recognizable. The handwriting she had been reading since a child's hand had first learned to form letters at a kitchen table in Port Arthur, Texas. She set the other mail aside and opened this one first, the way she always did when a letter came from Janis. What was inside was not what she expected. Not that Janis's letters were ever entirely predictable. Her eldest daughter had always written the way she talked, which was directly and at length, and with a disregard for the usual social buffers that most people insert between their real feelings and the page. But this letter was different in a way that Dorothy felt before she could name it. Quieter than usual. More deliberate. The sentences had the quality of something that had been thought about before being written, considered, weighted, placed with care. The letter said that Janis was doing well, that the recording sessions were going better than she had hoped, that she had found something in the music she was making that felt right, in a way she hadn't felt in a long time, maybe ever. She wrote about the band with warmth and specificity, naming the musicians individually, saying something true about each one. She wrote about Los Angeles in September, the particular quality of the light there, which she had never entirely gotten used to but had come to appreciate as its own thing. And then toward the end of the letter she wrote something that Dorothy read twice before she continued. She wrote, "I know we don't always understand each other. I know I've been hard to understand. But I want you to know that I understand now, more than I ever did before, what you were trying to give me. I know it didn't always look that way from my end. I think I was too busy being someone you didn't recognize to see that you were trying to hand me something real. I see it now. I'm sorry it took so long." Dorothy sat at the kitchen table in Port Arthur for a long time after she finished reading. She read it again. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope and sat there with the September light coming through the kitchen window and thought about what she was going to write back. She wanted to get it right. She never got the chance. 3 weeks later, on October 4th, 1970, Janis Joplin died in a hotel room in Hollywood. She was 27 years old. The letter she had sent to her mother in September was the last one she would ever write. And Dorothy Joplin, who had been sitting with her response, choosing her words, trying to find the language for something she had also been trying to say for years. Dorothy kept the letter for the rest of her life. This is the story of that letter, and of everything that made it possible, and of what it means that the most honest thing two people said to each other came when one of them had 3 weeks left, and neither of them knew it. To understand the letter, you have to understand the distance it crossed. Not the geographical distance from Los Angeles to Port Arthur, though that was real, and the miles had carried the particular weight that distance carries when it is chosen rather than imposed. The distance the letter crossed was the kind that accumulates between two people who love each other and cannot find a common language for the love, and who therefore build, over years and small misunderstandings and large ones, a structure of not quite saying that eventually feels like the normal way of things. Seth and Dorothy Joplin were not cold people. They were not distant parents in any dramatic sense. Seth was an engineer at Texaco, a thoughtful man with genuinely intellectual interests. He read widely, thought seriously, encouraged his children to do the same. Dorothy had attended college when that was unusual for women in Southeast Texas, had a sharpness of mind that she passed on to her children in ways that were visible in all of them. They were, by the standards of Port Arthur in the 1950s, a progressive and attentive household, but they were also a household with a clear sense of what a life should look like. A person finished school. A person found stable work or married someone who had it. A person lived in a way that the people around them could recognize as a life. These were not unusual expectations for the time and place. They were, in many ways, a form of care, an attempt to protect children from the particular dangers of instability and uncertainty by pointing them toward the paths that had proven, for previous generations, to be survivable. Janis was constitutionally unable to walk those paths. Not unwilling exactly, or not only unwilling, genuinely unable, the way a person with perfect pitch is unable to hear a note played slightly wrong is anything other than wrong. She felt things too much, wanted things too specifically, had too clear a sense of what was real and not real in her own experience to perform the contentment that conventional paths required. She was someone who needed the thing she was doing to be the actual thing, not a version of it, not an approximation. Music was the actual thing. Everything else had been approximation. Dorothy understood this intellectually before she understood it emotionally. She could see, when Janis was still in high school, that her eldest daughter was made differently than the paths available to her in Port Arthur, and that the distance between Janis and those paths was not going to close over time. She understood this the way a person understands something they cannot do anything about, with a kind of helpless clarity that sometimes expressed itself as worry, and sometimes as frustration, and sometimes in the late hours, as simple grief for the things she could not give her daughter. A world that fit her. What Dorothy could not fully understand for years, and what Janis could not fully understand either, was that the other side of the same not understanding was operating simultaneously. While Dorothy was watching Janis move through the world in ways that frightened her, Janis was watching her mother, and wishing she could make herself more recognizable, less alarming. Neither of them could give the other what the other needed. And neither of them said this clearly for years, because saying it clearly would have required a language they had not yet found together. The letters that passed between them during Janis's San Francisco years were frequent, and in their way warm. Janis wrote home regularly, more than many people knew, maintaining a correspondence that belied the image of total rupture that some narratives of her life suggested. But the letters were careful. They reported facts. They used the vocabulary of connection, affection, inquiry, the small news of daily life, while leaving the deeper things unaddressed. Both women were skilled enough with language to maintain this for years, to make the letters feel substantial while keeping the most substantial things just off the page. Then, in September 1970, something changed. The Pearl sessions had been running for several weeks when Janis wrote the letter. She was at Sunset Sound in Hollywood, working with producer Paul Rothchild and the Full Tilt Boogie Band on what everyone in the room could feel was the best work she had ever done. The sessions were disciplined, focused, alive in the specific way that recording sessions are alive when the music is being made rather than executed. She was sober in ways she had not always been sober during previous recording periods. She was present with a consistency that the people around her found both impressive and slightly different from the Janis they had known before. Not different in character, but in depth, as if something that had always been there had come more fully to the surface. People who were close to her in those weeks describe a woman who seemed to have arrived somewhere. Not at peace, exactly. Janis was never fully at peace. The intensity was too constitutive for that, but at a kind of clarity, a sense of things being in their right proportion. She was making something she believed in completely. She was surrounded by musicians who gave her what she needed musically. She was also, in those weeks, thinking about home. Not home as a physical place, but about the people she had come from, about what she owed them, and what they owed her, and whether those accounts could ever be settled. She was thinking about Dorothy. The evidence for this comes partly from the letter itself, and partly from things she said to people in the weeks before she wrote it. Linda Gravenites, who had been one of her closest friends since the San Francisco years, said Janis talked about her mother more than usual in the fall of 1970. Not in any dramatic or distressed way, but with a thoughtfulness that suggested she was working something out. She said Janis seemed to be reconsidering the story she had told herself about her childhood, not revising it entirely but adding something to it, finding a perspective that the years and the distance had made available. What Janis seemed to be arriving at was the recognition that the difficulty between her and her mother had not been one-sided in the way that the simpler version of her own story suggested. The simpler version, the version that made for cleaner narrative in interviews, was that Port Arthur had rejected her and her family had not fully understood her, and she had left and found her people and her music and built her own life. That version was true. It was not complete. The more complete version included the recognition that Dorothy had been trying, in her own language and with her own limited tools, to do what parents try to do. To prepare a child for a world that had specific dangers. To protect her from the particular vulnerabilities that came with being Janis Joplin in a world that did not always know what to do with someone like her. The protection had not looked like protection from Janis's side. No, it had looked like constraint. But the intention behind it had been love, filtered through the only forms available in Port Arthur in the 1950s. Janis wrote the letter on a Sunday evening late September, after a recording session that had gone particularly well. She wrote it by hand, on plain paper, and she wrote it the way she was singing that fall, without the usual buffers, without the careful management of what to say and what to leave unsaid. She wrote to her mother. She wrote the truth. The content of the letter, in its fullness, has been described by members of the Joplin family with a care that reflects their understanding of its privacy. What is known, what has been described in interviews, in Laura Joplin's memoir of her sister, in accounts given by people Dorothy spoke to in the years afterward, conveys its emotional register even without verbatim reproduction. The letter was warm and specific. Janis wrote about the sessions with genuine excitement, describing Paul Rothschild in terms that made clear she respected him not just professionally, but as someone who understood what she was trying to do. She wrote about me and Bobby McGee, which she had recorded earlier that month, in terms that suggested she knew what had happened in that recording booth, knew that something complete had been made. And then she wrote about the distance. Not dramatically, not with the old pain, or not only with the old pain. She wrote about it the way someone writes about something they have finally found a way to see from two sides simultaneously. The side they have always occupied and the side they have spent years unable to access. She said she knew it had been hard. She said she knew she had been hard, harder than she needed to be sometimes, using the hardness as a kind of proof of something that she was not sure anymore needed proving. She said she understood that what her mother had been doing all those years had been its own kind of trying. Dorothy read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning. She read it twice. She sat with it for a long time. She thought about what to write back, how to match what Janis had done, how to find her own words for the things she had also been carrying for years without the right language for them. She was not a woman who found this kind of emotional articulation easy. She had her own accumulation of almost said things that had piled up over the decades until they had become their own kind of weight. She wanted to get the response right. She wanted, for once, to say the actual thing. She took 3 weeks trying to find the words. On October 4th, 1970, Janis Joplin died at the Landmark Motor Hotel in Hollywood. She was 27 years old. The cause was an accidental drug overdose. She had been in the middle of what everyone around her recognized as the best period of her professional life, making the album that would prove to be her masterpiece, living with a clarity and purposefulness that the people who knew her well found quietly remarkable. The news reached Port Arthur by telephone. Dorothy Joplin learned that her eldest daughter was gone before she had sent the letter she had been writing, in response to the one she had received 3 weeks earlier. What happened to Dorothy in the days and weeks and months after that is appropriately private. The interior experience of a woman losing a child does not belong to public narrative. What is known is that Dorothy kept the letter. She kept it for the rest of her life. She did not give interviews about it, did not discuss its contents in public. She kept it in the way that people keep things that cannot be replaced and cannot be answered. Pearl was released in January 1971. Dorothy listened to the album. She listened to me and Bobby McGee, which Janis had mentioned in the letter with the quiet excitement of someone who knows they have made something complete. She listened to it knowing that Janis had written to her about it, and hearing in it perhaps the specific quality that Janis had been reaching toward in all the years of making music. The thing that had seemed from Port Arthur like recklessness, and that was from a different angle fidelity. Laura Joplin, Janis's younger sister, who wrote the biography of her sister, and has been the family's primary voice in the decades since, has described the letter as the most important thing she knows about the relationship between Janis and their mother. She has described it as evidence of something that the public narrative of Janis's life misses, that the leaving was not the end of the relationship, but a phase of it, and that the relationship was moving, in those final weeks, towards something that had not been possible before. The letter was the arrival of that something. Arrived 3 weeks before the end. Arrived in time to be read, but not in time to be answered. The question that the letter raises, the question Dorothy Joplin lived with for the rest of her life, is whether it matters that the answer never came. Whether the incomplete exchange is a tragedy, or whether the letter itself, The fact of it, the words in it, the truth of it, was enough on its own. There is no clean answer to this. Dorothy Joplin did not offer one, and she would have been right not to. The question has the kind of incompleteness that certain losses create, a gap that cannot be closed, that you learn to live around rather than through. But something can be said. The letter was written by someone who had arrived at something. Not resolved, Janis Joplin was 27 years old, and her life was in genuine becoming. But arrived. She had made the best record of her life. She had found, in those final weeks, a clarity that expressed itself not only in the music but in the letter, in the willingness to say the actual thing to the person it most needed to be said to. What she said to Dorothy in that September letter was what she had been saying in her music for her entire career. Translated into the private language of a daughter speaking to a mother, I was real. I felt everything. I know it was hard to watch. I know you were trying. I see it now. Dorothy kept the letter. She kept it folded along its original creases, in the envelope with the handwriting she had known for 27 years. She kept it the way you keep something that is the closest you will ever get to a conversation that should have been longer. Because even an incomplete conversation, when it contains something true, is better than the silence it replaced. Janis Joplin has been gone for more than 50 years. The music she left behind has outlasted the context that produced it, has reached generations who were not born when she stood on those stages, has been heard in private and in public, has done the specific private work that music does when it is genuinely, rather than performatively real. Dorothy Joplin outlived her daughter by decades. She gave occasional interviews about Janis, always with a carefulness that reflected her own interior complexity. The pride and the grief and the unresolvable weight of loving someone you couldn't always reach, and losing them before the reaching was finished. She spoke about her daughter with a warmth that surprised people who expected otherwise, who had absorbed the simpler version of the story. What was there was a mother who had received a letter in September and had been trying to find the words to respond when the time ran out. What was there was a woman who kept a folded piece of paper in an envelope for the rest of her life, because it was the truest thing her daughter had ever said to her directly. The letter said, I know we don't always understand each other. I know I've been hard to understand. But I want you to know that I understand now, more than I ever did before, what you were trying to give me. Janis wrote that. She wrote it at 27, in the last month of her life, in the clarity that had come from somewhere, from the years of searching and the music, and whatever it is that makes people finally able to say the thing they have been almost saying for years. She wrote it and sent it. Dorothy received it and kept it. And the conversation that began with that letter, the conversation that should have been longer, that should have had a response, and the years of further conversation that follow when two people finally find the right language. That conversation lives in the letter, incomplete and permanent, folded along its original creases, holding the most honest thing Janis Joplin ever said in private, which is, in the end, the same thing she was saying in public, every night, from every stage. I see you. I know we don't always understand each other, but I want you to know that I understand now. She said it to Dorothy in a letter. She said it to millions of people in a voice. Both were true. Both were complete, in their way and the time available. Both are still arriving, quietly, at kitchen tables, in the middle of ordinary Tuesday mornings, with the light coming through the window and a piece of paper in your hand that says more than you expected to find there. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It is still arriving.